or whatever, not Rumble.
Rockfin.
Rockfin picks up the stream.
We're on a few different platforms here. We're trying to synchronize the live streaming on all of them. So welcome, Ian Williams. How you doing?
No, I'm not ready.
Oh, you're not ready? It's
No,
too bad. We're going into it.
that's a false start.
There's, now that we're on all these other platforms, there's no such thing as a false start. It's like
Okay,
right when the first one goes live, we're live.
I'm ready.
So yeah, how you doing, Ian?
Doing well. Thanks for the opportunity. Happy to be here.
Yeah. This will be fun. Like we were talking about earlier, this book of yours, Soil and Spirit. It's an interesting book. I love the spiritual aspect of it, the kind of like take responsibility aspect of it. So we'll looking forward to jumping in there with you.
Let's go for it.
So I thought I saw something in there about you had like a spiritual experience or epiphany. I can't remember what you called it on sort of the genesis of this. And I love starting off with this because so many of our guests and people that have done, books or research projects have started out with something like that.
Yeah. Yes. Mystical experiences. I think what I termed it in the book. Not that the book dives deep into it for any listeners out there, but yeah, I was 24. So this is 2013. For those that want to do the math, I guess that shows my age.
10 years ago,
yeah. And had a dog. She was a beautiful pit bull for probably about 6 years up until that point. And she was just a little bit unstable, like some dogs are. So there was a number of people bites, animal bites, dog fights over the years. And there was one in particular that just kind of like put the kibosh on all of it. And it was a battle royale in the hallway of our apartment building. And there was a few of us out there in the hallway, probably like 15 minutes trying to break up this dog fight. Eventually we did, got back into the apartment. She's got blood all over her face. I got blood all over my hands. And she just looked at me with those eyes like, what next? Like for her, the moment was totally gone. And for me in that moment, I knew I can't keep doing this. Like I can't provide for this dog in the way that I need to in order to provide the quality of life for her. And her quality of life is affecting my quality of life. And at this point, as a family, we had done just about everything we could. As a dog family, we had done just about everything we could to keep her around. So we made the difficult decision to let her go early. She was probably 6 or 7. She was a rescue, so we don't really know. So we put her down December 30th of 2013. And then like 4 or 5 days later, I was laying awake in bed one night and I was staring at the ceiling, thinking about the dreams that I was having, thinking about my life. And she nudged the door open. And I could feel her energy come into the room and she hopped up on the bed next to me. And I turned and I looked and I could see her and I could hear her breathing, but she didn't make an imprint on the mattress. And it was so soon after we let her go that I didn't think anything of it. It was like still normal to have her in the house. So anyway, I rolled over next to her and she curled up next to me and she sighed like that patented sigh, it's time to go to sleep. And I fell asleep. And I woke up the next morning and I was journaling about it because I thought it was a dream. And I was writing down my dreams at that point, just as means of processing. And it was while I was writing about it that I realized I was awake when that happened. I had no way of wrapping my head around that experience. It was so far outside the realm of possibility for me. So it kind of just blew the doors off what I thought reality was or could be. And that was really the turning point for me. Like somebody said to me the other week, so you got visited by the ghost of your dog? I was like, I guess that's one way to put it. Yeah, I've never thought about it that way, but like, yep, that's pretty much it.
Did you get the sense that everything was all good? I mean, because it's a difficult decision putting an animal down. Like you're like, do you let it suffer for a while? Do you like, it's tough.
Yeah. I mean, I think we all interpret many things out of experiences like this, right? But every night we'd sleep together and she would always let out that sigh. And it was like, I'm ready for bed, and she was relaxed. And she wasn't a very relaxed dog by and large. So at night when she would sigh, she was ready for sleep, she was relaxed. And it was that same message, that same signal that she gave me. So certainly that's part of what I take from it. Yep. An opportunity to just let it go.
So how does that experience play into like the next part of your journey and the book? And
yeah, the next decade of my life. I mean, I woke up the next morning and like I said, I was writing about it and I realized at the time, I got to go figure this out. I got to like make sense of this. And it just so happened that the very next week I was going to be attending my first yoga class. So I knew, I guess for a little bit of context for the listeners, like at this point in my life when this experience happened, I was probably using substances for like 10 years prior to. So, as a background in addiction, I'm now 7.5 years sober. But at that point in time, I knew I had enough self-awareness to know like this dog occupies so much space in my life. And if I don't intentionally fill it, I know it's just going to be filled with more drugs and alcohol. And I don't want to do that. So I had made some like preemptive decisions, right? Like signed up for a marathon, started running, tried to start making changes to my diet, was journaling a lot, going to therapy, et cetera, et cetera. One of those things was yoga class. So I had this experience, was signed up to go to my very first yoga class the next week. And it was really just the beginning of, what I would call a spiritual path, right? In the sense of, I need to go make sense of this, which now I look back and I think that was a pretty naive perspective to have around it, right? It's hard to make sense of something so profound or mystical. But that led to yoga. That experience led to yoga. Yoga led to meditation. Meditation led to Qigong. Qigong led to martial arts, Tai Chi. Like I just kind of went all in on the Eastern energy arts. And that really defined and has defined in many ways the last 10 years of my life. So it was, we could say the first step in the book, but it happened a long time ago. I didn't start writing the book until like 2.5 years ago. A lot of stuff has transpired since then.
I got to tell you about this experience I had in treatment and recovery with Qigong. I was I was in there for cocaine and alcohol addiction. I just passed my 15 years a couple of months ago, and finally ready to do the Qigong class that was in this place every morning. And I was also reading Eckhart Tolle's book, The New Earth, at the time, and I was like picking out spots to read for people like in the group classes and stuff like that. I was a total geek in there. But I finally went to Qigong, and then after that night, I had a really good Qigong session. I was like, holy fuck, this is amazing. And I opened up that book and I looked down, randomly opened it up and looked down, and the word I saw was, when I looked down, was Qigong. I was just like, holy shit. Yeah, it totally blew me away. Big synchronicity.
Yeah, those when you start paying attention, those synchronicities happen more and more.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So so how did you what took you towards writing the book then? Like if that's been last couple years, 3 years, then what about before that?
Honestly, it was the reason that I wrote the book was impetus. It was largely other people encouraging me to do it. I'm a big picture thinker. I'm a systems thinker. And I'm really interested in trying to be a part of solving these global challenges like climate change and social justice, et cetera. And so I'm always kind of head up in the clouds. And, for you, having gone through 15 years of recovery at this point, like it's one thing to get sober, but it's another thing to start processing the emotional content, which is why you started using in the first place. So for me, that journey of, this experience, first yoga class, and then in the subsequent year, starting to get serious about my sobriety, I had to do a lot of that self-awareness, a lot of that self-reflection, a lot of that processing through the emotional content, the somatic stuff. And as I was doing that, I would share the experience with other people. I would share the insights that I'd learned about myself and the connections that I had made about, hey, this thing from my past manifested in this way in my present. And now here's what I'm going to do about in the future. And I just had enough people ask me like, well, where'd you learn that? Where did you come across that? How did you discover that process? Who taught you that? And the answer was always the same, like just came from within. I don't know. I just sat down with a pen and a pad or I sat down in silence, or I went out into the natural world and I just came up with it, or it came out of me. And after I'd heard enough people say, like, you should really find a way to put this in writing, to teach this to other people, that was really kind of the impetus of the book. But it was, 7 or 8 years in the making. In the beginning, shortly thereafter, going deep on the energy arts. At that time, all I was really doing was I was still processing intellectually, but I was building what I would call like a toolkit to experience my physical body and my emotional content, because at the time I didn't have the skills to do it, right? Like something would be uncomfortable would come up and I'd just go get high and I'd check out, right? So it's not really like a skill. It's just a compulsive habit. So as I started to process through all that stuff and started to build the skills to be able to be in relationship with my body, that just led to a more subtle understanding of self and life. And so that path, that discovery path, self-discovery path, eventually led me out of my career and into the one that I'm in now, led me back into school, totally transformed my social group, and eventually led to the book. It's kind of a convergence of many things, but it all started with that self-discovery and curiosity process, and just continuing to tease the thread and follow the breadcrumb trail.
Can you talk about how you incorporated that sort of personal internal journey into the book, which is kind of about, soil and spirit and the planet, and sort of us taking care of things on a bigger picture a little bit better? Because it is, I like the way you kind of interwove that in there.
Yeah, I mean, again, for the listeners out there, like the book is not about me at all. It's a big picture book. It's a big idea book. But the central thread of the book is, in order to address these grand challenges, we need to go inward and do our own personal work, right? That self-discovery. So these kind of, like I was talking about, the many things converging at the same time. It was this personal discovery piece. It was the spiritual practices. And then it was a lot of time spent in nature. Time in nature was integral to my healing process. And so what I mean by that is a lot of the lessons from nature we can apply to our own personal and spiritual development. So for example, like one that I often start with that's easy to think about is diversity in nature is actually what creates resilience, right? So for anybody out there who has a lawn in their front yard, they know how difficult it is to keep the weeds from moving in, right? Or if you think about industrial agriculture and growing crops at scale, the single crop at scale, it takes a lot of energy to suppress Mother Earth's natural tendency, which is to create diversity, right? It's the same thing internally for us. When we create monoliths or monocultures in our own life, then we're suppressing our natural processes. So it's these three things, right? Nature, spirituality, self-discovery. And you might say that those last two are one and the same, but for me, they were a little bit different, at least in the beginning. So the book is really meant to it's meant to lay out a linear path for the reader that walks them through how to be a part of the change without doing anything externally, but rather starting with that inward journey, right? So there's 4 sections to the book. And if you've read it, then like there's the internal landscape, social landscape, external landscape, and spiritual landscape. The idea is that if we want to create change in the outer world, we need to create change in the inner world. But that's a pretty, I don't know, you might call it like esoteric or ephemeral process, right? It's not very tangible to say go inward and do that inner work. My attempt with the book, Soil and Spirit, is to demonstrate the connection between the two. One is that there's a soil, there's a substrate, there's a foundation to the spiritual process. But the other is that our spirituality is intimately connected to nature, right?
Yep. Yeah. Oh man. So getting out in nature, grounding, all that stuff, like, can you tease that out a little bit? Because I've recently, I was reading to my girlfriend, like there's a lot of science behind this, like, especially in the last 10 years, like even just like the anti-inflammatory changes in your body from grounding, the pain management, like it really does make a difference. So it's not just like, you're not just talking about going out in nature, like there really is a physical difference.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody's interested in the science, just Google nature-based therapeutics. There's a whole field of research devoted to this, right? So you mentioned anti-inflammatory, stress reduction, pro-social behavior. There's all sorts of things. And it's pretty obvious when you think about it at a higher level, right? Because we co-evolved with nature. And so naturally that's going to have an interplay in our health and well-being. But there's also now, and this is part of it's part of what I really enjoy about this time and this day and age in terms of science, because the science is starting to bear this stuff out. It's not just correlative anymore. We can actually show the causation, right? And so this terms of nature-based healing and the health benefits of nature, at this point, the argument is not really, does it heal? Is nature healing? It's to what extent, right? It's about dose and dosage. How much do we need, in what form, what constitutes nature, etc.
That's a good point. It
So
seems to be accepted now. Like I see it from more mainstream journals and stuff, even like the benefits of grounding. Like 10 years ago,
yeah,
that was all like very sort of woo woo, you know?
yeah. I mean, and it, in some ways, I feel like it often kind of parallels the whole biohacking field,
Yeah.
which is interesting to me, and at the same time, it's a little too like scientific.
Or
And I don't mean that
techie.
in,
Yeah.
yeah, like it's not necessarily just because it's my cup of tea doesn't mean that it's not valid. That's not what I'm trying to say. But for me, my relationship with nature and the healing that came from it was much more of an intuitive process,
Yeah.
So like when I talk about nature immersion, it was taking a hike one day, getting lost in the woods, ended up sitting underneath a tree for a couple hours. Right. And if anybody's ever taken the time to do that without the distraction of the cell phone or a book to read or anything else, like if you sit there quietly long enough, like nature will move back in around you, right? The birds will come in and the squirrels will come
Oh,
in, and
interesting.
you just become a part of the ecosystem. And after having that happen enough times, I realized I'm never separate from it to begin with. I'm only
Right.
thinking that I'm separate from it, right? And so, being from Minnesota up in the Midwest, we have the boundary waters. So when you get up there to the thousands upon thousands of acres of just wilderness, and all you have to do at night is sit on the shore and watch the sunset, like that was really where I started to learn some of these lessons of acceptance and inclusivity, because I felt a part of the landscape, as opposed to this separate being who's walking on the earth as opposed to walking in the earth, if that makes sense to put it that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I read this. A lot of this reminded me of Gordon White's book called Animistic as well, because he talks about this post-activism stage. So it's kind of like, animism, but also from a mystical point of view.
Hmm.
And he talks about how, we are a part of nature. Like we're not just separate, right? And part of the problem with the environmentalism movement is that it just treats us as totally separate. It's not a part of it. Did you
I think,
find that at all as well? Because you talk about being like sort of one with nature, but we're also looked at as a disease in nature.
yeah. And, we might say we are our own disease, right? Like if you think about the environmental challenges, or like one thing that I start the book off with is the sixth mass extinction,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Like it's knocking at our door. And there's been 5 previous mass extinctions on planet Earth, the most recent being the Jurassic, but none of them have ever happened by the hand of a species on the planet, right?
So
And so we
what
have
is? Can you dig in that a bit too? After you explain that, yeah.
just the idea that this single idea that we are separate from nature has created the entire delta of environmental devastation that we now find ourselves amidst. This notion that we could supersede natural law, right? We can start farming in a way that's not natural to Mother Earth, or we can start traveling in a way that's or extracting natural resources, right? I had a Lakota or Dakota elder years ago talk to me about that phrase, specifically natural resources, basically saying, when you define the earth as a natural resource, you're defining it as a reservoir to deplete, to take from. And so a lot of this stuff is rooted in our psyche and our perception. We're looking at the world in a specific way because we see ourselves as separate from it. And that separateness, in my experience, leads directly back into the whole Eastern spiritual philosophy, right? About like non-identity, non-attachment. When we're not identified with ourselves, whether ourselves as an individual or a family or a community or as a civilization or a species, we recognize that we're always a part of the whole. So, maybe it's a bit philosophical, but that's, again, going back to the science of the day and age. That's part of what I love about what's happening right now, is because all this stuff is starting to be, it's playing out scientifically, and you can't deny it anymore in that sense.
So what is the main thing behind the sixth mass extinction then?
So, well, tell me a little bit more.
Like that
What do you mean?
that humans are causing a mass extinction of ourselves or of all species on the planet? Like how, and
Mm-hmm.
and how, I guess, how are we causing it in a in accordance with the science that's there right now?
I think it's really easy to oversimplify this conversation. So again, for all the listeners out there, please take it with a grain of salt, right? Because we could easily spend the next week dialoguing about this, and many conferences do. Loss of biodiversity is equating to, in many ways, mass species die-off. Like if you look at the extinctions list, there are dozens of species that are going extinct every single day. And we can see it starting, we're reaching a tipping point. If you think about, even if you avoid, some of the mainstream, like thinking about the polar bears or thinking about, the plains animals that roam in the Great Sahara, like even if we remove some of those like bigger keystone species that we're all learning about in second, third, fourth grade type of thing, looking around, like I'm on a book tour right now, driving an internal combustion engine, and I haven't been around on this planet a whole lot, only a couple decades, but like I can think back to a kid taking a road trip, just the windshield was covered in insect splatter. And I'm driving around now and it's like mostly clean windshield, right? So there's correlative stuff. But back to your question, more specifically, loss of biodiversity is key, right? As the human species expands in terms of population, that has also correlated with taking up more space. Of course, there's a conversation about global warming, and we could split that hair in a million different ways, but that is essentially resulting in increased volatility in weather patterns. And so I think it's easy for particularly, those of us who live in the Western developed world to think, well, climate change isn't happening yet. But the reality is if you talk to indigenous communities or coastal communities or people who live in the tropics, it's been happening for a long time. Storms are becoming more severe. And eventually, if we keep pushing all these things towards that tipping point, the science tells us we're going to go past the tipping point. And it's not necessarily to suggest that like the meteor is going to strike and we're all going to be gone in a matter of a week. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about with the sixth mass extinction. It's more a notion of we're turning this planet into something that will be inhospitable and not compatible with human life, right? We are essentially going to farm ourselves out of existence. And I use farm metaphorically, not literally in that sense. So, the book, again, like right off in the introduction, this is not a book that's trying to convince you of climate change. Like that's not even the conversation that I'm trying to have. The point is whether or not this stuff is real. And that's the other thing that, I tried to be overt about in the book is like, no matter what your beliefs are, doing this inner work is going to be beneficial for you and others and the planet.
Yeah, that's the challenging part for me is like I know we're destroying the planet. I just don't necessarily always believe we're destroying it in the way they say. The way I'm told I'm destroying it is going to be more money and taxes for me to help fight an invisible sort of enemy kind of thing. And I don't trust the powers that be after the last few years. And now I'm asked to to comply with a bunch of other things that they say that they have the answer for. But I think the corporations are destroying the planet. I mean, in a lot of other ways, chemicals and the oceans. And I mean, it's a tough one.
It's highly complex and it's interrelated, right? I mean, this is another lesson that comes directly from nature. It's natural law, this notion of interconnectedness. So the solutions, if we just call it climate change, or really anything, social justice, anything else, they're existing at this kind of intersection of the private industry and sector, the public sector, and then us as consumers. And when you put those three things in a melting pot together, you get a lot of complex problem solving, right? And so it's far too easy to oversimplify this conversation. It's far too easy to hope that there's going to be a silver bullet, it's just that magic bullet that cures all.
Yeah.
But I think to your point about, ultimately making the change boils down to behavior modification. And that exists on a spectrum for people. Some people are willing to do more than others. Some people are willing to sacrifice more than others. Bottom line is, I think if we're going to see this through, there's going to be a lot of sacrifice required for a whole lot of people. And predominantly, that's going to be centered in those of us that live in the developed world, because we are the people who have consumed the most resources and we become the most comfortable, right?
Yeah.
And it's not to say that we need to go back to a tribalism. That's not necessarily what I'm suggesting either. It's a notion that we need to find ways to innovate, to build a regenerative future, right? Not one that's sustainable, because if we sustain what we're doing now, the science tells us we're still heading for the cliff. But this idea that if we can build something that's regenerative, then we can actually move forward.
Getting back to nature, working with nature. So this is the other thing I have a hard time picturing. Like, when would we have been working with nature in the past? Like, we're extracting like huge megalithic stones thousands of years ago. We're logging like crazy. Even primitive times, like, were they destroying nature, or are we just doing it way worse in the last like 300 or 400 years since the Industrial Revolution? Like, because when we're looked at as a pariah on the earth, then we would have been looked at that like all the way back, right? I mean, we're always using resources.
I think it's a beautiful question. And, perhaps the simple answer would be there's more of us. And I'm not suggesting that we're overpopulated.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily believe that's the case. But, there's more of us. So naturally, we're going to consume more resources. We're going to have a larger footprint. At the same time, if everybody who had a lawn here in the United States turned that lawn into a garden, they don't even need to do the gardening themselves. Just hand it over to someone who does want to do the gardening, right? Like, a lot of our food insecurity issues would disappear overnight.
Yeah.
So the question about, I think the other thing that's really fundamental here is we need to recognize.
Sacrifice we're talking about then, just letting someone make a farm in my lawn, is that the extent of the sacrifice? Are we talking about a bigger sacrifice? And who's making the decisions for said sacrifice, and who's making what sacrifices, and who's exempt from those sacrifices? Can you kind of outline what that sort of looks like for me?
So let's go back to that intersection of the private sector, the public sector, and then us as the consumer, right? Again, it's too easy to oversimplify this conversation, but to Graham's point earlier, like, especially for the largest companies on the planet, massively resource consumptive. And so often the bill of goods that we're sold is, well, you as the individual or you as the family need to bring the reusable bag to the grocery store, drive less miles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those things will all have an impact, and certainly a larger impact cumulatively. But if we're looking at a Fortune 500 or a Fortune 100 company, the resource consumption at their scale is going to dwarf anything that we can do as a family or a small community. That relationship, of course, is directly.
But ultimately, their production is still based on our consumption. So if you start limiting their ability to produce, that's going to affect my ability to consume. So, depending on what industries those are, I guess at the end of the day, what I want to know is what personal freedoms am I sacrificing for the greater good? Because that's what it boils down to is I'm going to lose a certain level of freedom that I'm used to so that the world can be better off, if I'm understanding that. Because that's ultimately what the sacrifice is going to amount to, right? Or is it just letting the neighbor that wants a bigger garden use my front lawn? Because I can get on board with that. They could farm it. They can give me 20%. We can figure something out for that. But if someone's telling me how far I can drive my car and where I can drive my car or what kind of car I have to have, that starts to blur some lines for me on because if I sacrifice the car to the electric one, sure, that's great. But now ultimately the state is deciding where I can go with my car, because if there's not a charger within this many hundreds of miles of where I'm at, then I can't go there anymore. So I guess I'm not willing to really give up any more of those freedoms as an Indigenous person living in Canada, because, you know, I feel like I've given up enough freedoms, you know, and not just me, all Canadians have given up enough freedoms. It's just sort of been this slippery slope towards less freedom for 155 years. So are we able to implement that without sacrificing the very thing that makes us the West, which is our freedom, arguably? Not even arguably. I would say that you can't even argue that point. That has been the selling point of Western civilization for 100 years or more. See, at least since World War II, you know, we were the free and blah, 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 and they were not. And before that, that's been the selling point for America, at least, arguably Canada and Western Europe as well.
So I mean, your point is well taken. And I would say, first off, Darren, like, I would challenge the concept of freedom. And this goes back to my notion about, like, do we actually exist outside the bounds of natural law? Because the concept of freedom here in the West is essentially rooted in colonialism, which is this command, control, conquer paradigm, right? And so if you look at capitalism, which is the underlying economic model of the West, what you effectively have is an infinite growth paradigm on a planet that has finite resources. Assuming that we're using those
Why does
resources.
capitalism need to have an infinite growth paradigm, though? Why can't it just sustain at some level? I mean, it's being sold like that in a debt-based society that needs to keep creating more debt. But I don't feel like capitalism can be blamed for that. If we go back to capitalism at its fundamental level, that's just the ability for me to exchange my goods to other people without other people getting involved in the, you know, that they just, and I can make some money doing that. And so I guess I don't know what the question is there, but I don't feel like I feel like capitalism gets blamed for a lot of problems that maybe aren't capitalism's fault and might have more to do with the state getting involved and controlling sectors and playing favorites
Yeah,
and things like that.
right. But
Regulating competition.
where I'm driving is not necessarily that capitalism is the fundamental challenge. Capitalism is undergirded by human nature. And that's the whole concept of the book, right? Is that in order to effectively address some of these grand challenges and injustices in the world, we can't rely on institutions and governments to do the problem solving for us. And if we as individuals are going to be part of that change, if we're going to be our own effective agents of change, in order to be most effective, we need to go through our own self-actualization process, right? And so I don't necessarily think that you and I are on different pages. I think we might be screaming at the same moon from different sides, right? To Graham's point, or to your point earlier about if the company is limited in terms of what it can produce, then we're limited in terms of what we can consume. I agree. But the other thing that I think is at play here is this notion of human nature and more specifically, perspective and perception. We can choose to perceive this as a loss of our liberties, a loss of our freedom. The challenge with that argument for me is that we all define liberty and freedom differently. And from a spiritual perspective, there's a line in the sand. This has been my experience, at least, where it's one thing to have a conversation about rules, regulations, laws, etc., and how those impact our daily lives. And I don't think that we can necessarily argue that systemic oppression exists. On the other side of that line, there's no institution, governing body, relationship, person, etc., that can prevent us as individuals from turning inward and diving deep into that's the soils of self, right? And doing that self-discovery process. And so to tie this back to this notion of responsibility, for me, the personal realization was as I was doing my own self-discovery, the more insight that I have into my human nature and the more insight I have into how I'm impacting the world around me, the more responsibility I have to show up and take care of the world around me. And so back to that specific word freedom and my challenge of it, it's not that I'm one definition of freedom could be this definition right in the West. But I would question and potentially even argue, is it really freedom in the first place? Right? Because if we're still as individuals, not even talking about societies, if we as individuals are still stuck in our own compulsive behaviors and ideologies and psychologies, are we truly free? And so for me, that's why this is a spiritual process.
I mean, it's hard to argue. I can't argue with that. I'm not interested in arguing with that. I mean, if we had better people, then all of the isms would work just fine. I would still pick capitalism over other people telling me what to do, because I want to limit that as much as possible. So if I can maintain my level of personal sovereignty throughout the thing, then that's something that we can talk about. But I just think my personal opinion is that our best chance of getting out of what, and I don't want to take this as an argument that I agree with man-made global warming, because I'm just not going to get involved in that right now. I don't, but it's not a conversation that we need to have right now. But I really think that capitalism is ultimately our best way of finding our way out of this. We got away from using coal plants and stuff like that because of people just constantly trying to outcompete each other with innovation.
On that point,
if you can get me an electric truck that will go fucking 1,500 miles, and no one's allowed to hack into it and change anything. It's not even connected to the fucking internet at all, period. It's my truck. I've paid for it. It goes 1,500 miles on a charge, and I can put some gas in it if I want in case I'm in a jam and I get stuck someplace. Then I'm happy to go electric. But the market has to fucking get there first. I don't want to be forced onto a market that's substandard to the level of where we got now, because I'm worried that just slowly, Atlas shrugs back into a society where we're just fucking stuck in these little corners, and that inevitably turns into tribalism. That's the part they don't get to in Atlas Shrugged, is if you go 1,000 or 1,500 pages past each other, past the end of the book, those fucking states are fighting each other and shit again, because that's ultimately what the cycle is going to come to when there's not enough this, or there's not enough food, or there's not enough, it's good. Unless something changes in what seems to be the history of the world that hasn't changed on a cycle for the last, at least recorded history, I don't see. I don't know.
That's exactly the point that I'm trying to make in the book, right? Is this boils down to human nature, right? In order to solve these problems, let's not even define them as problems. In order to create a space where everyone has the right to pursue their own liberation, we can enhance that right through the social systems and environmental systems that we create. And so, to the point about the electric vehicle, right? Let's zoom out a little bit. To your point about innovation, I agree with you. There's like, in terms of my day job and the work that I do with organizations, I've very explicitly decided to try and work with innovative companies that are largely building tech solutions to solve big challenges, right? Because in order to scale those solutions, we need innovation. And the free market, at least in my experience and observation, moves faster than the public, right? Moves faster than the government. And so in order to address those things at scale, in the time frame that the science suggests that we need to address them on, then in my opinion, that's where I can have the greatest impact, right? I don't necessarily have any desire to walk into Congress and start lobbying. It's not my area of expertise. It's not my area of interest. But the reason that I learned that is through that self-discovery process, right? Through knowing my own internal nature. And so this is precisely what I'm talking about. Like, I don't necessarily think that you pursuing your liberty infringes on my ability to pursue liberty. At the same time, we need to be able to have that conversation in tandem with the systemic oppression that does exist and has existed, because it's also a part of human nature.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the electric car one happens to be a pretty good example, because there's going to become a resource problem with that too. It's not the
Absolutely.
it's not the final solution. So it's
Absolutely.
yeah, it's an interesting quandary.
My horse comes with a resource problem. You know what I mean? If there's not enough fucking water stops between point A and point B, you're not going to point B unless you're hauling the water with you somehow. You know, in the winter, it's a whole, you know, there's like that sort of limit on it all. I'm happy to adapt along with society as long as it's not forced upon me, which is the problem I'm starting to see in some of the
Yeah.
different corners of the world. Like, we're going to do this and you're not going to have a choice, and we're going to do that and you're not going to have that shit anymore. It's like, okay, well, you know,
It's a fascinating thing, because we've talked about spiritual stuff all the time on the show, and nature, and getting back to that, and solutions, and colonialism and all that. And Darren's pushed back against, our government for, as an Indian, written some books and stuff on it. And but we're in a weird spot where my main concern is now trust, like trusting the authorities and what science is what now. I mean, because it's pretty easy to kind of just take whatever data you want and form your own opinion, or keep your same opinion. I mean, it's really hard to trust. They want to block out the sun. I mean, we just had Jackie Jolie on. We just released an episode with Jackie Jolie, and she's talking about the importance of the sun. And she does a really good job at talking about the circadian rhythms and how important it is to really get out there and get that light. Not, we're just living indoors now, right? So we never get that light, and how that'll change your body. It'll change your whole mechanism. You can sleep better, and how important that is. And yet they're seriously talking about blotting out the sun, or at least, covering it up. So, like, I just don't trust that. Don't block out the sun. Like, there's got to be other solutions.
There are other solutions. At the same time, I think that we're at a point in the evolutionary process where we're just in one of those like generative phases where we need to throw as many ideas at the wall as possible.
Yeah.
100 years from now, they're not all going to stick.
Yeah.
Right. And this is the wheel of evolution.
Yeah.
Right?
And I'm okay with brainstorming and throwing ideas out there, but when it's the most powerful people in the world throwing those ideas out there, I just don't trust it. And
this is what brings me back to my point. Like we can have a conversation about systemic oppression and injustices. We can have a conversation about an infringement on liberties. There's no conversation to be had about us turning inward and doing our own self-liberation.
Right.
There's no body out there. There's no governing body or agency or company or anything out there that prevents us from doing that work.
Yeah.
That prevents me from reaching out to Darren and saying, hey, do you want to farm my front yard? Because I don't, but I'm sick of mowing it, right? And I can see it be put to better use. There's nothing that's preventing that. And that's a process. That's an inward journey, right? And so it's easy to get caught up in the narratives of the day. And this, I think, from a human nature standpoint, like it shines light on the fact that we are still predominantly processing the world intellectually. And to bring this conversation full circle back to my mystical experience, there was not a damn thing that was intellectual about it.
Yeah.
It was entirely experiential. And that's what changed my reality. And so I fundamentally agree. Like, it's difficult to have these conversations at this point. And there's a number of reasons why. But the bottom line is, this is an experiential process that we're going through. And so long as we continue to choose to approach life and problem solving and relationships with others and conversations, etc., primarily through our intellect, we're limiting ourselves because it's only one facet of the body, right? There's the physical body, emotional body, mental body, spiritual body. If we integrate a more holistic intelligence into this process, into ourselves, if we awaken that within ourselves, then we're going to have more tools and resources and ability to address these challenges outside of ourselves.
Yeah, and even use discernment. I mean, discernment is a big one that can come from that process. Becoming emotionally attached to certain narratives. I love it. I love it how you talk about, and I think this is a major issue too, is that the materialism, which is sort of, overlaps with the colonialism. You mentioned that in your book a little bit, but I would think it's somewhat separate, but the materialism, the science, the how much do you think it plays a role that the general science right now doesn't believe that we have a soul or a spirit, or that we can't, that we don't live beyond, because that's a core problem to me. It's a core issue with talking about living with nature and doing our inner work, is like, we're not just, a meat suit. We have other abilities, we have other powers, we have other perceptions. Like, how much of a problem does that play, do you think?
I think it's probably only a problem for those who haven't experienced these things for themselves, right? Like,
But they want to hack us now, right? They're like, human beings can be hacked. There is no soul. I mean, the people are saying that.
I mean, I think everybody's got to be discerning in terms of what information they take in, right? And it is like, it's honestly one of the bones that I have to pick in terms of the extremely scientifically minded conversations and narratives that are out there, because empirical data will never be able to empirify the entire world.
Yeah.
Right. Like, it's just not possible. And you can even look at this, right? I mean, this is science, right? The moment you look at that subatomic particle, it changes.
Yeah.
So there's just simply no way to classify the entire world, because it is an evolutionary process. And it's the same with the self. And so to be in a position where, I guess I would just go back to this concept of like, the narrative is being predominantly driven through intellect. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the intellect. It's just a matter that it's out of balance, right? It's so heavy intellectually, and there's not as much a conversation around these other aspects of intelligence. At the same time, like we started off the conversation, it's beautiful that there's a field of nature-based therapeutics that is studying the empirical science and data of the healing capacities of nature, right? So you're always going to get the yin and the yang together. It's the way it works.
Yeah. I love that. In Gordon White's book, he talks about there's an indigenous guy in Austin, and I think it's in New Zealand, and he's trying to figure out what to do with this old sort of mound. There's an ancient sort of mound there, and he sits on this hill for 6 months, every night for 6 months, to try and figure out, like, how do we work with nature with this? Like, and he's told to build another one, but he's told the exact dimensions and everything of how they used to be built. So he goes along this process of building it, like, within nature.
Right.
So it just I love the story. I love that there is a way to communicate or to commune with nature, but how do we silence ourselves? And that's I think that's that intelligence you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, the body is a tuning fork, right? And the mind is just one part of it. The body is receiving these signals all the time. Like I just heard this beautiful example the other day. Think about the radio. You're on the wrong channel, you hear static. You dial into the right channel, the song appears. Well, the song was there before you got to the channel, but could you perceive it? No, like it wasn't in your field of awareness, right? The body's a tuning fork. It's always receiving these signals. And there's intelligence at deeper and much more subtle layers. And it takes a certain amount of devotion to self-cultivation to be able to start to interpret those layers, right? It takes devotion to sit on a hillside for 6 months, right? Seeing something through. Like writing the book was a 2.5-year process for me. I learned a hell of a lot about myself because what I realized was, aside from my sobriety, there's nothing else in my life that I've committed to that extent, to that depth, right? To see something through that much, that far. These are things that we just don't experience. We won't know them until we devote ourselves to them. And that's part of the beauty of it, right? Like this part of the mystery. And I think this goes back to like the exchange that Darren and I were having is it's a lot about perception and how we choose to define the road ahead, because we could choose to perceive it as loss and sacrifice, or we could choose to perceive it as something else. And that's a matter of personal choice as well.
Well, we had a chat with somebody who made me really think about freedom in a different way, because there was some people sort of following along with what they were told, and that made them feel free. And I was like, this guy, he's making sense. Like, some people feel freedom in a different way. If they're just, led around and told what they're to do, that might make them feel free.
Might
They
make
don't
them
have to
feel
worry about
free,
it.
I would argue.
Yeah, but I
I
mean,
would argue.
but that comes down to perception, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's fair.
Doesn't make me feel free, but yeah, it's interesting.
There's a difference between being free and feeling free. Yeah.
How would you define the difference?
Well, feeling free, a lot of things probably feel free that aren't, my dog probably thinks it's free. It's not, it exists at my pleasure. My cats, I let them come and go as they please, but they're still not really. Oh, the cats maybe are kind of free, I guess. Maybe definitely freer than the dog, because they could just wander off and never come back. I don't care about that, but well, I guess like just what Graham described. If you're outsourcing all of your decision making to other people, you might feel free, but I mean that's your right as a free person to do that, but that's not actually being free. It's like being in a big enclosure, but you just never actually get to the walls because you're not interested in going that far.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, to make it more literal for the individual, for the human, like, are we really free to choose what we eat and drink? Right? I mean, like, we need that stuff to survive. And so is that freedom or is that bondage? Right?
Yeah.
And that relationship with food or with other people, is it a conscious, intentional relationship? I'm not a huge fan of the word conscious because I feel like it's become new agey. But like, is it an intentional relationship, and are we aware of the totality of it, or is there a certain part of it that's unconscious and therefore compulsive? We don't choose to get hungry. We're hungry because of our evolutionary DNA. Is that freedom? I mean, we could split these hairs in, more than a million ways. But this is why I think the conversation about experiential understanding and awareness is so important. Because the moment that two individuals experience something to be the same, now we have an understanding. We're no longer debating ideas, philosophy, and dogma. We're having a conversation about experiential awareness and understanding. And I think that's just, it might be a subtle shift, but it changes the dynamic of the conversation.
So I think an important thing to touch on before we wrap it up is this true north, self-study, like how to find your purpose kind of thing. And once you do you have any advice for people that have sort of found that, what they think is that path?
I get asked this question on a regular basis. And if I think back to the book, I may have used a different phrase. And I tried to be explicit in the writing that life is not necessarily about finding one thing and devoting yourself to that one thing. But I would say that true north is this pursuit of liberation, right? Self-realization. And once people have found it, I would say it's simply a matter of staying devoted to it. I think the more challenging component is the beginning of the journey, right? This notion of, so like Graham, you and I can use this as an example through personal experience, coming to terms with our addiction, right? I mean, you first have to just acknowledge this either is the way I want it to be or it's not the way I want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you acknowledge it, then you have to take the next step, which is choosing to do something about it. And that opens up a can of worms that you're going to have to see yourself through. And you might be able to find guidance and support in other people, but ultimately you're the one that has to do the work yourself, right? And once you see that process through, on the other side, the clearing becomes, I mean, it shows us a lot about ourselves, self-awareness, personal insights, spiritual discoveries, etc. And we can use those things to start to triangulate our quote unquote true north. What am I naturally good at? What am I passionate about? How can I be of service in the world? And then triangulate those things to find a place. And it's probably not going to be your perfect destination right off the bat, or it's certainly not going to feel perfect, but it's the start of the journey. And so, for people who ask me like, well, how do I get started on this personal discovery piece? The main thing I say is just devote yourself to discovery, get curious, because the more that you learn about yourself, the more data and insight you'll have along the way. And then eventually you'll get to a point, and there's a passage at the end of the book, which is know self, K-N-O-W, know self, N-O, right? You get to the point that you know yourself well enough that there's not really a self anymore, or at least you can start to experience aspects of life where you're like not as identified with your individual self. And that for me is where the fun starts. That's where real life began for me. And I was just fortunate enough to have that start unconsciously, right? I mean, like I was just fortunate enough to have that experience with my dog that just blew the doors off the hinges. And then all of a sudden my perception was radically different than the day before. It literally flipped like a switch. Not everybody's fortunate enough to have that experience. At the same time, with all the research and practice of the energy arts that I've done, like we can all cultivate these skills to start to observe and be aware of the nuance and the subtleties. So that's a long-winded answer, but I would say in the beginning, commit to that self-discovery process. And then once you feel like you have, quote unquote, awaken, then the step becomes getting out of bed, devoting yourself to a life of service, whatever that means to you.
Yep, that's good. Darren, do you have any questions for?
No, that's good. I like that. That's I mean, personal sovereignty and personal development should go hand in hand with each other. As long as they're not fucking with other people's shit, hard to argue with that. I agree.
Ian, do you have anything? Do you think that we touched everything? Do you have anything else from the book you want to talk about?
I mean, it's a big idea book for people who are interested in doing the work and, hopefully a slightly different perspective than something that they've come across. It is not a self-help book, though it might be put on the bookshelf in that category in some bookstores. It's really not meant to be that at all. It's not meant to be a 1, 2, 3 steps to a new you. It's a book about exploration. It's a book about having challenging conversations like this. And so if someone, feels like if any of the listeners out there feel like they want to dive in and swim in that end of the pool, then I'd say go for it, pick it up. I also feel like, there might be a part 2 to this conversation down the road, because this feels like there's a whole lot of stones left unturned that we could continue to explore.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, they need exploring. I mean, something's gonna give eventually, and it'd be good to have some idea of what might work and what's broken.
Yeah, that's a long conversation. And
there's
Maybe next time we could get a little bit more focused in terms of what lane we're going to stay in.
Yeah,
Because
let's
I
do that.
agree, Darren. There's a lot to be discussed, and there's a lot to prepare for, and there's a lot to question.
And there's a lot in common because we all want to get back to nature. I mean that's a theme that's growing quite a bit with us and our listeners and stuff, is the appreciation for nature and getting back to it.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Right on, Ian. Thanks.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate the opportunity.
Where can everybody find your book and your stuff?
Yeah, you can get it on any online major retailer, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Goodreads, etc. If you want to find it through my own website, or if you want to contact me directly, it's www.reviveyouandi.com. It's the word revive, the letter UANDI.com. And if you want to find me on social media, that's my same handle on all the major channels, Revive You and I. So reach out, find it, pick up a copy, send me a message, let me know what you think, leave a review. I mean, this is the stuff I live for, conversations like this, hearing from people who've read the book, debating, dissecting, exploring. This is what it's all about right here.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on the show, Ian. This has been fun.
Appreciate it, gentlemen.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.
Have a good night.
You too.
And that was a chat with Ian C. Williams. What do you think, buddy?
Yeah, that was great. We got to do it again.
Yeah, that was a fun
I
one.
like his suggestion. Yeah, we should.
We should. Are you doing a garden?
Well, no, but I thought about it.
Officially into planting season.
I should, but
Yesterday it was like planting day, so they say not till after May long weekend in Alberta. So
well, same with Saskatchewan. It surprised me a little bit. They never do that until May long weekend.
unless you have a greenhouse.
Yeah.
I mean, you could do grain and shit, I think, but yeah, it could still snow. I mean, it could still snow, but it probably won't.
Yeah. No, I think it was an intriguing book. I mean, some of it sort of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit, but he wasn't very dogmatic in talking about that stuff. And I really like his, personal responsibility and the inner work part. I really think I'd love to know what he thinks about that animistic book.
It's a good book.
That's one of my favorite books. Have you listened? Is it on audio yet? Animistic? You got it?
I have it on the shelf.
Yeah. Have you
read some of it?
Did you? Yeah. You'd love the audio version if Gordon could get that done.
What's it called? Animistic?
Yeah. Annie dot mystic. ANI dot mystic. I think he's gonna do it on audio, but I just don't know when it is.
I don't see it on there now, but I'm sure he will. I'm sure it'll be good. It's easier for me to listen for sure, but I should read again. I do like, Gordon's
work. Yeah.
Big thanks to Ian for coming on the show. Big thanks to you guys for listening. Even bigger thanks if you're one of our supporters, one of our people that help us keep the lights on around here. Year 10. I mean, we're probably just had our 10-year anniversary when you listen to this. It's probably come and gone, right? This isn't going to come out.
I think this is going to come out right prior to our 10-year.
Oh, really? Or we're about to have it.
I think, yeah.
Either way, head over to grandamerica.ca/support today. Make a one-time donation or sign up for monthly or do something cool like that. It's a value for value show. So it is adding some value to whatever you're doing while you're listening. Sign up today. $1 a month, $2 a month. You decide. Other than that, head over to grindamerica.ca for everything we're up to. There'll be links to everything and all our other podcasts and audiobooks and trips in the show, in the menu there. Other than that, we love you guys. Thanks for listening. And we will see you next week.
You might be. It's gonna come out after. I think there's one in the can already. So
excellent. Well, thanks for tuning into the live show, guys. Haven't seen Monica in a while. Buddy Bill Loby.
Yeah, good to see everybody.
All right. Ciao, motherfuckers.